Hello and welcome to a journey into a world that no longer exists. A world that rose from the edges of collapsing sultanates, from windswept steppe camps, and from the slow grind of empires turning into dust. Imagine an empire without marble palaces at the beginning, without ancient titles to inherit, without the wealth of old kingdoms. An empire that by all logic should never have endured, should never have expanded, should never have crossed mountains, deserts, and seas. And yet, for centuries, it grew like a tide that refused to ebb. Tonight we begin the story of the Ottoman Empire before its fall, a slow journey through its rise, its power, its intricate structure, its splendor, its burdens, and the quiet machinery that held three continents together. How did a frontier tribe become a world superpower? How did a handful of warriors craft a system that outlived kingdoms older than time? How did a dynasty maintain one of the most complex political orders the world had ever seen? How did an empire rule Armenians, Greeks, Arabs, Serbs, Bulgarians, Kurds, Egyptians, and more without collapsing under the weight of its diversity? And what shadows were already gathering long before decline was visible? Tonight we will drift through landscapes of stone fortresses, caravan roads, calligraphed decrees, janissary barracks, shipyards along the Golden Horn, and quiet council chambers where decisions shaped continents. Before we begin properly, let us slow our breathing as if settling onto a wooden balcony overlooking the Bosphorus at dusk. Let the mist on the water soften the world. Listen for the distant sound of an oar, a marketplace settling a prayer, dissolving into the night. Feel time loosen its grip as we step backward gently into another age. Now, in the dim glow of memory and imagination, we return to the 14th century, the frontier that dreamed of empire. The Ottomans began not in the heart of the world, but at its frayed edges. Their earliest foothold lay in the hills of northwestern Anatolia, where broken Byzantine towns clung to life and frontier warlords vied for scraps of territory. This landscape defined their character. It was a borderland of uncertainty, punctuated by abandoned farms, makeshift towers, and the distant clang of rival chieftains testing the limits of power. Here stakes were constant. A village lost meant families wandering toward starvation. A watchtower taken meant the movement of borders. Every decision could alter the fate of dozens, sometimes thousands. Into this terrain stepped men like Osman and his companions, warriors shaped by scarcity rather than abundance. They were not kings, not yet, but leaders who understood the language of shifting alliances, the currents of opportunity, and the ways empires die slowly, long before they fall swiftly. The Ottomans' first innovations were simple, yet transformative. The organization of raids into disciplined campaigns, the weaving of tribal loyalty into something sturdier, the recognition that boundaries were invitations rather than deterrents. What set them apart was not merely boldness, but method. Where others struck with bravado, they struck with purpose. Where others claimed victory, they claimed structure. The first architects of order. Before the Ottomans built cities of domes and courtyards, they built something more difficult, a governing idea. This idea grew slowly like a blueprint, revealed one chamber at a time. It suggested that authority must not be scattered but harnessed, that loyalty was to be cultivated, not demanded, and that an empire could not be held by the sword alone. The stakes in these early years were existential. Byzantine garrisons still guarded the old roads. Rival beyliks competed for farmland taxes and prestige. Every clan dreamed of being the one to unify Anatolia. Into this political storm stepped early administrators, scribes, and spiritual leaders. They helped define courts where disputes could be settled with parchment instead of blades. They recorded land farm by farm to ensure that rights were preserved and taxes predictable. They began shaping a structure that could outlast the founding generation. Their innovation was subtle, a balance between Islamic law and practical governance, a recognition that local customs mattered, a willingness to incorporate Christians, Jews, and nomadic groups into a flexible system. What emerged was not uniformity but cohesion. A frontier society evolved into a state that could breathe, but new challenges were already rising beyond the horizon. The rise of the devoted troops. Every empire faces the same question in its youth: who will defend the dream when the dream grows too large? For the Ottomans, the answer came through one of history's most controversial and consequential institutions, the Janissary Corps. The stakes behind this creation were stark. Frontier warriors alone could not hold expanding territories. Tribal loyalties fractured as victories accumulated. A personal army loyal only to the sultan seemed both necessary and dangerous. From this tension emerged a corps unlike any other. Young boys, often from Christian villages, were taken through the Devshirme levy, converted to Islam, and trained not merely as soldiers, but as instruments of state. To understand their innovation, we must see beyond the surface. It was not their discipline alone that transformed the empire, but the idea that military power could be recast as institutional power, new, loyal, methodical, relentlessly organized. Their barracks became schools, their drills became rituals, their service became identity. The Janissaries were a furnace in which the empire's steel was forged. They protected borders both fragile and vast. They upheld the sultan's authority during moments when the dynasty itself trembled. And yet the seeds of future turmoil were sown here too, in the tension between loyalty and influence, in the dangerous authority granted to those who bore arms within the palace gates. But for now, in these early centuries, they were the empire's sharpest edge, the council behind the veil of power. In the heart of the growing state, beyond the clang of armor and the dust of frontier roads, another battlefield emerged, one shaped not by spears but by whispers. For as the Ottomans expanded, the stakes shifted from survival to stability. Territories needed oversight, taxes needed structure. Promises made to frontier warriors needed careful fulfillment. And most importantly, a dynasty needed to act not merely as conquerors but as rulers whose authority could not be undone by distance or dissent. The answer lay in a new institution, the Divan, the Imperial Council. Its innovation was subtle, almost invisible, but profoundly transformative. Instead of relying on tribal elders or battlefield captains, the empire invited scholars, jurists, financiers, and seasoned administrators into a disciplined, here beneath the cooling shade of colonnades. Decisions flowed like water across inked parchment. Grain disputes from Thrace were weighed against fortification needs in eastern Anatolia. Cross-border raids were balanced against the necessity of maintaining peace with neighboring beyliks. Legal rulings were discussed not as abstractions but as tools to bind an expanding people into a coherent whole. Humans shaped this quiet revolution. Viziers whose measured tones could redirect the path of an army. Scribes whose ink transformed orders into law. Judges who balanced Islamic principles with local customs. Envoys who carried agreements across mountains and seas. The innovation was not bureaucracy itself. Many empires had tried that, but the blending of order with adaptability. The Ottomans built a system firm enough to govern millions, yet flexible enough to absorb new cultures without fracturing. But the divan was only one chamber in a palace whose foundations were still growing, the sultan's shadow over the realm. As the empire matured, the role of the sultan transformed. He was no longer merely a warrior riding at the front of a cavalry charge. He was becoming a symbol, a figure whose decisions shaped not just the battlefield, but the deeper rhythm of administration. The stakes of leadership grew heavier. Expansion meant responsibility, responsibility meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant that a single misstep could unbalance provinces hundreds of miles apart. Sultans like Murad Bey and Bayezid I understood this shift instinctively. They began centralizing authority not through force alone, but through ritual ceremony and carefully cultivated distance. The palace became both a residence and a stage. Its architecture reflected the transformation gardens arranged with unnatural precision, hallways designed to quiet footsteps, chambers constructed to filter audiences through layers of protocol. Every gesture carried meaning. A pause in an audience chamber could signal approval or dismissal. A decree delivered with the sultan's tughra, the imperial signature, commanded obedience far beyond the palace walls. A moment of silence could reshape the future of a province. This evolution marked a new milestone. The empire no longer relied solely on charismatic leaders, but on the aura of the institution itself. Through this quiet consolidation, the Ottomans discovered the strength of a throne built not merely of stone and wood, but of ritual and perception. And yet another transformation was beginning, one that would expand the empire's reach across continents. The road of caravans and cities of light. An empire cannot grow by war alone. It must breathe through commerce roads and the slow, steady movement of people and goods. As early Ottoman rulers stabilized their domains, they recognized that controlling trade routes meant controlling destiny. Caravans carrying silk, spices, grain, metalwork, and manuscripts became threads weaving the empire together. The stakes of this commercial expansion were immense. A disrupted route could impoverish towns for years. A fortified pass could redirect wealth toward or away from the state. A single caravan lost to bandits could weaken trust in the empire's ability to guarantee safety. To face these challenges, the Ottomans built caravanserais where merchants rested under the protection of the sultan, bridges whose architectural grace mirrored growing confidence, markets where guilds flourished under carefully regulated oversight, customs stations where taxes were collected with predictable fairness. Behind this economic rise stood thousands of human agents, merchants negotiating with distant cities, nomads guiding caravans through bitter winters, craftsmen hammering iron in workshops lit by oil lamps, scribes recording inventories with meticulous consistency. Their innovation was the creation of a commercial ecosystem that balanced state oversight with local autonomy. It allowed the empire to harness wealth while respecting diversity. Even conquered cities found room within this network, their traditions preserved rather than erased. Caravan roads became the empire's veins, markets became its heartbeat, and the steady hum of commerce softened once hostile borders. But expansion brought new responsibilities and new vulnerabilities. The fortress cities of the Crescent. The Ottomans understood a truth that many powers ignored: an empire can stretch far only if its borders do not break. Thus began the age of fortress building, a silent yet monumental project spanning decades. Cities once neglected were refortified with walls thick as winter cliffs. Watchtowers crowned hilltops that had known only the wind. River crossings were secured with iron-banded gates, and newly conquered strongholds were repurposed into administrative hubs. The stakes behind these fortresses were absolute. A breached wall could unravel an entire region. A poorly supplied garrison could invite rebellion. A fortress, lost at the wrong moment, could reverse a decade of expansion. Human agents shaped this fortified world, engineers measuring rock and soil with patient precision, stonemasons whose hands shaped the empire's outer skin, commanders training garrisons to withstand sieges, governors managing the delicate balance between military readiness and civilian life. Innovation lay not only in architecture but in integration. Fortresses became garrison towns became trade hubs became stable provinces. The empire grew not as a patchwork of conquests, but as a connected landscape of fortified, prosperous regions. Still another layer of power was rising within the palace, a silent world of negotiations, alliances, and shadows, the hidden machinery of influence. As the empire expanded, its court became a labyrinth of personalities, ambitions, and whispered alliances. Power no longer rested only in the throne or the council, but in the quiet corridors where advisors conversed, envoys lingered, and family members shaped destiny through subtle persuasion. The stakes of internal politics were dangerous. A misjudged alliance could provoke rival factions. A misinterpreted gesture could trigger rumors that echoed across provinces, and a single advisor gaining too much influence could shift policies in ways the sultan never intended. The human drama within the palace was guided by viziers balancing caution against ambition, princes whose future reigns cast long shadows over the present, court scholars interpreting laws and histories for political ends, diplomats navigating relationships with Venice, Genoa, and neighboring beyliks. Their innovation lay in the evolution of the empire's internal dialogue. The Ottoman court became a place where knowledge, strategy, and perception carried weight equal to military force. This invisible machinery of influence strengthened the empire's ability to adapt. Every faction, every voice contributed to a system flexible enough to survive power struggles that might have shattered a less cohesive realm. But beneath the polished order, new tensions simmered, the kind that grow not from weakness, but from strength. And though no one realized it yet, these tensions were the first distant echo of an empire that would one day stand at the brink of transformation. The codex of the realm. The Ottomans had built fortresses for borders, armies for conquest, and councils for governance. But as their dominion stretched across mountains, plains, islands, and ancient cities, they needed something even more enduring, a system of law that could weave disparate lands into one unbroken fabric. The stakes were immense. Without a common legal foundation, provinces might drift apart. Without careful documentation, tax disputes could ignite rebellions. Without a clear hierarchy of authority, local leaders could challenge the sultan's will. And so emerged one of the empire's quiet triumphs, the expansion of Qanun, the sultan's administrative law, which complemented Sharia without overriding it. This codification did not appear suddenly. It grew through debates among jurists, through decrees revised in the divan, through inspections carried out in remote provinces, and through the sultan's desire to create order beneath the surface of overwhelming diversity. Human agents were essential scholars who interpreted centuries of precedent with meticulous care. Scribes who traveled dusty roads to record land households and rights, inspectors who ensured local officials acted justly, judges who applied law with an eye toward both equity and stability. Their innovation lay in transforming law into a living instrument flexible enough to honor local customs, yet firm enough to safeguard imperial authority. Ink as much as iron held the empire together. But unified law required a unified record, and that was the next challenge. The great ledger of lands. No empire can endure long without understanding its own foundation. For the Ottomans, that foundation lay in land, its fertility, its ownership, and its capacity to sustain soldiers, cities, and the treasury. The stakes of managing land were existential. A poorly governed province could starve, a tax system built on guesswork could collapse, a region treated unjustly could revolt. To prevent such instability, the Ottomans developed a remarkable system, the Tahrir Defterleri, the empire's detailed land registers. These were not mere lists, they were portraits of provinces recorded with precision that rivaled the work of modern surveyors. In these ledgers, scribes catalogued farms and their yields, vineyards and orchards, mills turning by river currents, villages and the families within them, obligations, rights, and local customs. The human work behind these records was painstaking. Teams of scribes rode through mountains and plains, measuring fields under summer heat, conducting interviews in winter courtyards, listening to elders recount land boundaries older than memory. Their innovation was to treat information not as a static artifact, but as the lifeblood of administration. The empire's tax system, military organization, and economic planning all depended on these ledgers. The result was stability, a rare and precious achievement. But stability created new expectations, and new expectations revealed deeper layers of power. The machinery of the Timar, beyond law and land, lay a system that sustained the Ottoman cavalry, the Timar. The stakes of this institution were palpable. The empire needed soldiers who could ride at a moment's notice. It needed a military class loyal to the Sultan. It needed a method to reward service without draining the treasury. The Timar offered a solution. Cavalrymen known as sipahis were granted the right to collect taxes from specific lands. In return, they were obligated to maintain horses' armor and retainers ready for war. This system tied military strength to agricultural productivity. It ensured that those who fought for the state also served it in peace. And it created a network of local guardians who maintained order outside major cities. But it also required human vigilance, provincial governors who supervised the system, inspectors who prevented corruption, sipahis who balanced the demands of their lands with those of the battlefield, local villagers who depended on fairness for survival. The innovation was the blending of feudal-style obligations with a highly centralized state structure. Unlike European knights, sipahis did not own their land. Their power existed only through service, a brilliant design that preserved loyalty while limiting ambition. Yet even as the Timar strengthened the empire, it hinted at future strain. Growth meant complexity, complexity meant friction, and friction would soon find a new arena, the loom of many peoples. From the Balkans to the Levant, from Anatolia to the Black Sea, the Ottoman Empire governed an astonishing mosaic of cultures, yet diversity, while enriching, carried delicate stakes. How could an empire preserve unity without erasing identity? How could it respect religious differences without weakening authority? How could it incorporate communities with ancient traditions into a system only centuries old? The Ottoman answer was the millet system. Rather than forcing uniformity, the empire allowed religious communities, Orthodox Christians, Armenians, Jews, and others to govern aspects of their internal affairs. They maintained their own courts, clergy schools, and customs under the umbrella of imperial oversight. This structure required patriarchs who mediated between the sultan and their followers, community councils who managed local disputes, tax collectors who ensured obligations were met fairly, imperial officials who resolved matters crossing religious boundaries. The innovation lay in balancing autonomy with allegiance. Rome had demanded unity, Persia had centralized authority. But the Ottomans built a system where difference was not a threat, it was an asset. This approach allowed cities like Salonika, Bursa, Edirne, and Damascus to thrive as multi-ethnic centers of trade and culture. Yet beneath this harmony, fault lines existed. Prosperity often sharpened identity. Identity could become leverage, and leverage in time could reshape political loyalty. The empire was learning to live with contradictions, a necessary skill for a realm spanning 3 continents. But another force was rising, one that would soon redefine its horizons: the ships that carried the crescent. Even the most land-focused empire eventually turns its gaze to the sea. For centuries, the Ottomans had grown through cavalry sieges and riverside fortresses, but their ambitions and their enemies increasingly required mastery of the waves. The stakes of naval expansion were vast. Control of the sea meant control of grain routes, pilgrim ships, trade lanes, and coastal defenses. It meant influence over the Mediterranean, the Aegean, and the Black Sea regions contested by Genoa, Venice, and rising European powers. Shipyards sprouted along the Golden Horn. Timber from Black Sea forests flowed into naval arsenals. Carpenters hammered through long nights by torchlight. Engineers designed galleys that could move with astonishing speed. Human expertise defined this maritime transformation. Admirals who studied wind and current as carefully as generals studied planes. Artisans crafting hulls that balanced strength with mobility. Oarsmen whose synchronized rhythm made warships dance across the water. Navigators reading stars with a confidence born of repetition. The innovation was strategic, a fleet built not merely for battles, but for logistics, diplomacy, and the movement of administrators across vast distances. Seas that once separated lands now connected them. But every expansion, naval, administrative, military, or cultural, required one final unifying force: the voice that held the empire together. In a realm of hundreds of dialects and dozens of languages, the Ottomans needed a shared tongue for diplomacy, law, poetry, governance, and ceremony. That voice became Ottoman Turkish, a refined synthesis of Turkic roots, Persian elegance, and Arabic precision. The stakes of language were subtle but profound. Without a common administrative tongue, orders could be misread. Without shared literary forms, elite culture could splinter. Without a unified script, knowledge could not flow between regions. Scribes, poets, clerics, and scholars shaped this linguistic golden thread. Their innovations defined the empire's intellectual landscape: poetry that blended spirituality with statecraft, chronicles that preserved memory with disciplined clarity, letters whose ornate style conveyed hierarchy and respect, legal documents whose phrasing left no room for doubt. This was the empire's unseen glue, soft enough to welcome new influences, strong enough to maintain identity across centuries. Yet even as law, language, land, and logistics reached new heights, the Ottomans were approaching an age of unprecedented ambition, an era of conquests, splendor, and challenges that would elevate the empire to its zenith. What lay ahead would reshape the world. the city that beckoned across the sea. Long before the Ottomans possessed it, Constantinople was a dream suspended between continents. Its silhouette walls against sky domes against the morning sun tempted every ruler who looked westward from Anatolia. For early Ottoman sultans, the stakes of taking the city were enormous. Control of trade routes, access to the Black Sea, a symbolic triumph over a millennium-old empire, and a unification of their domains into a coherent whole. Yet the city endured. Its ancient fortifications repelled armies. Its sea walls defied naval assaults. Its identity as the last remnant of Rome made it both sacred and fiercely defended. Sultans before Mehmed II tested its strength but did not break it. Raids circled its edges. Sieges probed weaknesses. Diplomacy and pressure chipped away at its allies, but it remained an island of Byzantine sovereignty in a rising Ottoman sea. The empire's internal preparations, however, were unmistakable. New fortresses along the Bosphorus, expanded siege capabilities, a navy increasingly confident in narrow waters. Human agency drove this momentum. Architects who calculated the geometry of fortifications, smiths forging cannons that grew larger with each generation, commanders drilling forces to operate in coordinated precision, engineers studying the city's defenses with disciplined patience. The innovations were not merely technological, they were strategic, logistical, and psychological. The empire had grown around Constantinople like a tide rising around a stone, and tides given time reshape even the hardest surfaces. But to transform ambition into conquest, the Ottomans needed a leader born with both vision and restlessness. The young sultan with an old dream. When Mehmed II ascended the throne, many underestimated him. He was young, untested, and surrounded by seasoned advisors, cautious of his urgency. But youth in this case was advantage. It carried no fatigue, no hesitation, no memory of failed attempts by predecessors. It offered a mind unburdened by tradition yet sharpened by study. Mehmed had absorbed histories of Alexander Julius Caesar and great medieval conquerors. He knew that empires did not survive on cautious stagnation. They survived by shaping the world around them. The stakes of his ambition were existential. If he failed to take Constantinople, he risked destabilizing the realm. If he succeeded, he would redefine the empire forever. Human influence guided his path, grand viziers urging caution or encouraging boldness. Artillery masters refining massive cannons that shook the earth. Naval commanders planning maneuvers through currents and winds. Religious leaders framing conquest as destiny. The innovation that defined Mehmed's early reign was not merely the scale of his ambition, but the integration of multiple disciplines, engineering, logistics, intelligence, diplomacy, into one coherent strategy. He was not simply preparing a siege, he was preparing a transformation. And as preparations accelerated, the empire itself began to shift under the weight of anticipation. The siege that changed the world. When the Ottoman siege of Constantinople began, it felt less like a military campaign and more like the turning of an era. The stakes were profound. For Byzantines, it was survival. For Europeans, it was the preservation of a spiritual symbol. For the Ottomans, it was legitimacy, unity, and the key to empire. Siege lines circled the land walls like iron threads. Naval blockades tightened the straits. Artillery thundered at dawn, shaking ancient stones. Supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements moved with a precision that reflected decades of preparation. Human endurance shaped every moment. Janissaries disciplined to move as one body. Miners tunneling beneath walls under perilous conditions. Artillery crews working through smoke thick as winter fog. Byzantine defenders patching breaches with desperate determination. Monks praying in darkened basilicas for deliverance. Civilians listening for cracks in the walls that held their futures. The innovation that changed history was the use of massive cannons, instruments of war that rendered ancient defenses vulnerable in ways unimaginable only a century earlier. But technology alone did not decide the siege. It was persistence, day after day, night after night, and a strategic clarity that never wavered. When the final breach opened and Ottoman forces entered the city, the world shifted. It did not erupt in chaos, it unfolded in solemn inevitability. The city had passed into new hands, Rome had fallen for the last time, and the Ottoman Empire stepped into the center of global history. But conquest was only the first step. What followed required an entirely different kind of genius. The city reborn from ash and gold victories can destroy as easily as they build. Mehmed knew this. He understood that conquering Constantinople would mean little if the city were left hollow, fearful, and fragmented. The stakes, after conquest, were delicate. Without repopulation, the city would collapse economically. Without tolerance, it would fracture into resentment. Without vision, it would remain a captured relic, not a capital. Thus began one of the most remarkable state-building projects of the medieval world. Mehmed initiated repopulation campaigns, drawing people from across the empire to revive neighborhoods. Architectural restoration, repairing aqueducts, markets, baths, and palaces. Economic incentives, reopening trade routes and guild workshops. Religious accommodations, allowing Christian communities to reorganize under new leadership. Human agents transformed the broken city into a new heart for a new age architects, designing mosques and public buildings with soaring ambition. Artisans restoring mosaics and carving new marble. Merchants reawakening the bazaars with scents of spices and cloth. Scholars establishing libraries and schools. The innovation lay in reimagining a conquered city not as spoils but as foundation. The Ottomans did not erase Constantinople's past, they repurposed it. Hagia Sophia became a symbol not of destruction but of continuity, a monument woven into a new narrative. And as the city transformed, so did the empire's identity, the empire of the centered world. With Constantinople, now Istanbul, as its capital, the Ottoman Empire entered a phase of extraordinary structure and ambition. The stakes of this transformation were global. A capital at the crossroads of continents needed institutions capable of managing armies, taxes, diplomacy, and diversity on an unprecedented scale. Thus began the reorganization of power, the imperial court now centralizing authority with intricate ceremony, the bureaucracy expanding to manage far-reaching provinces, the legal system refined to govern both Muslims and non-Muslims with clarity, the military strengthened for campaigns across the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Mediterranean. Human forces shaped the new order, viziers acting as engines of statecraft, court advisors refining the delicate balance of succession, diplomats negotiating with Venice, Genoa, Hungary, and Persia, administrators standardizing taxation with unprecedented precision. Innovation radiated through every aspect of governance. Istanbul became a magnet for ideas, merchants, scholars, architects, and artisans. Its skyline, domes, minarets, bridges reflected a growing confidence, a sense that the empire had entered a world stage on which few could rival it. And yet with every ascent comes a new horizon. The Ottomans had captured a capital, rebuilt it, and transformed their identity. But the challenges waiting beyond this moment, political, military, and cultural, would test not only their institutions, but the very structure of power they had labored so carefully to build. What rose next was an era of splendor and strain, expansion and introspection, a golden age and the pressures that accompany such brilliance. The Sultan, who ruled through quiet authority. In the decades after Constantinople's transformation, the empire found itself guided by sultans who understood that greatness required patience as much as force. Leaders like Bayezid II embodied this shift, men who preferred restoration over conquest, order over spectacle. The stakes of this transition were subtle but immense. Conquest created identity, but stability created longevity. Without consolidation, even the most triumphant empire could collapse under its own weight. Thus emerged a reign marked by gentler rhythms, borders fortified but not excessively stretched, trade encouraged rather than interrupted, internal conflicts managed with deliberate restraint, religious scholarship nurtured alongside statecraft. Human agents held this balance together, scholars advising on the harmony between law and theology, court physicians preserving the vitality of the dynasty, tax officials refining revenue without oppressing subjects, architects quietly expanding the capital's infrastructure. The innovation of this period was measured governance, the art of strengthening an empire not through expansion, but through refinement. Yet beneath this calm surface there were undercurrents of ambition. For empires do not remain still. They breathe through alternating moments of restraint and resurgence, and soon a new wave of leadership would redirect the empire toward breathtaking heights, the shadow of the Red Sultan. Where Bayezid II brought calm Selim, I brought an intensity that cracked the stillness like thunder. Selim's rise was swift, controversial, and marked by conflict within the dynasty. The stakes of his ascent were stark. Either the empire would tighten its military focus or risk being overtaken by rivals in Persia and Egypt. Selim chose decisiveness. Under his command, armies were reorganized, artillery modernized, and alliances recalibrated with cold precision. He moved with purpose against the Safavids, whose influence threatened the eastern frontier, and against the Mamluks, whose realm controlled the holy cities and the lucrative trade routes between east and west. Human power defined this turbulent era, military commanders hardened by campaigns across difficult terrain, Janissary officers pushing discipline to new extremes, logisticians ensuring troops crossed mountains and deserts without starving, diplomats navigating the fragile threads connecting European courts. Selim's innovations were strategic, not administrative. He understood that holding the empire required breaking the powers that encircled it. By defeating the Mamluks, he reshaped the political order of the Middle East. Mecca and Medina came under Ottoman protection, granting the sultans spiritual authority that extended far beyond territorial rule. But Selim's reign, though monumental, was brief. His son would inherit an empire transformed and elevate it to heights that would define centuries. The lawgiver and the poet. When Suleiman the Magnificent, known within the empire as Suleiman the Lawgiver, ascended the throne, the Ottoman world entered a new era of radiance. The stakes of his reign were extraordinary. He inherited wealth, armies, naval power, and legitimacy. What remained was to refine, expand, and elevate. Suleiman embodied a rare balance, a commander capable of decisive military victories, a patron of art and architecture, a reformer whose legal clarity preserved justice, a poet whose verses revealed introspection, a statesman whose policies resonated across continents. Humans gathered around him like spokes around a wheel, grand viziers, notably, the brilliant and controversial Ibrahim Pasha, architects, most famously, the visionary Mimar Sinan, legal scholars shaping Qanun into a refined instrument of governance, naval commanders who expanded the empire's influence across the seas. The innovations of this era were vast legal codification that balanced Sharia and state administration, architectural mastery that crowned Istanbul with mosques and complexes of serene beauty, military campaigns that pushed deep into Europe and North Africa, cultural patronage that turned the capital into a center of learning. Suleiman's world was one of balance between war and peace, order and creativity, power and elegance. Yet even in this age of brilliance, shadows formed at the edges of illumination. For the greater an empire's splendor, the heavier the weight of maintaining it. The sword that reached 3 continents under Suleiman. The Ottoman military achieved a level of organization and sophistication that rivaled any power of its era. The stakes of such expansion were unmistakable. Control of Hungary meant access to the heart of Europe. Dominance over the Mediterranean meant the ability to influence maritime trade. Victories in North Africa created a buffer against rival empires. The human elements of this enterprise were vast and varied. Sipahi cavalry riding across plains with the discipline born of generational service. Janissaries, whose musket volleys redefined the nature of siege warfare. Naval captains maneuvering galleys against Venetian and Spanish fleets. Engineers crafting bridges and siege towers with astonishing precision. Innovation defined their campaigns. Mobile artillery that adjusted quickly to terrain. Coordinated logistics supplying armies far from home. Diplomatic networks securing temporary peace when needed. Administrative systems integrating newly conquered regions with minimal disruption. These victories expanded the empire's borders to their greatest extent. 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, felt the pulse of Ottoman authority. But as borders stretched, so did responsibilities. And with responsibility came tension. fragility, and the faint sense that no empire, however mighty, could stand forever at its peak. The dome that gathered the sky. If Suleiman's campaigns shaped the empire's borders, Sinan's architecture shaped its soul. The stakes of his work were cultural and psychological. An empire defined by conquest needed symbols of permanence. A capital reborn from Byzantium needed spaces that announced confidence, beauty, and balance. Sinan answered this call with structures that rose as if pulled upward by an unseen force, domes so wide they seemed to defy gravity, minarets, slender as reeds, courtyard interiors where silence felt like a living presence. Human hands brought these visions into reality, stonemasons chiseling marble with reverence, carpenters aligning beams with mathematical discipline, calligraphers inscribing verses that blended devotion with artistry, laborers lifting stones that would outlast empires. Sinan's innovation was not merely technical but philosophical. His structures embodied a harmony between form and function, devotion and power, simplicity and magnificence. The Suleymaniye Mosque stood not only as a place of worship, but as a statement that the empire had reached a height where art, governance, faith, and daily life intertwined seamlessly. But empires built on beauty as much as on force must face a truth. After heights come plateaus, after plateaus come shifts, and beneath every dome, however majestic, lies the quiet murmur of change. The palace. Behind the silk curtains within the walls of the imperial palace, the rhythms of governance changed. The sultan, once a rider, leading armies across continents, now presided from chambers layered in ceremony. The harem, the privy chambers, and the elite inner service corps grew in influence, creating new pathways through which decisions flowed. The stakes of this transformation were delicate. As the palace grew more complex, the distance between ruler and realm widened. Access to the sultan became a form of power. Silence, once a symbol of discipline, became a space where influence could bloom unseen. Human figures shaped this subtle shift. Valid sultans, mothers of reigning sultans whose counsel carried immense weight. Chief eunuchs whose proximity to the inner palace made them indispensable. Court tutors shaping the minds of young princes. Scribes and companions translating the world beyond the palace into controlled fragments. The innovation of this era was not architectural or military, but institutional intimacy, the creation of an inner circle where politics, family, and ritual combined. This new balance was neither corruption nor decay. It was adaptation, the natural evolution of a vast empire adjusting to the demands of complex governance. Yet even as palace influence grew, the world outside its gates remained restless. The provinces that carried the weight. The farther the empire stretched, the more heavily its provinces bore the weight of governance. Anatolia, once the heartland of Ottoman expansion, became a labyrinth of trade routes, villages, garrison towns, and local leaders whose loyalty was constant, but whose needs multiplied with each generation. The stakes were multifaceted. Agricultural surpluses needed protection from fluctuating climate. Distant governors needed resources without becoming autonomous. Tax systems required careful balancing to avoid unrest. Local rivalries needed mediation to prevent violence. Human actors across the empire shouldered this burden. Cadis judges who enforced law in courts that blended imperial order with local tradition. Timar holding Sipahis whose fortunes rose and fell with the productivity of their lands. Merchants whose caravans stitched distant regions together. Guild leaders who preserved craftsmanship in workshops humming with activity. The innovation of the Ottoman provincial world was distributed responsibility power shared among layers so that no single disruption could fracture the whole. Yet tension brewed beneath the administrative stability. Success created expectations. Expectations required resources. Resources demanded efficiency, and inefficiency, however slight, could ripple into discord. The empire had reached a point where its greatest strength also carried the seeds of future strain. The Janissaries at the crossroads. Once the disciplined core of Ottoman military might, the Janissaries now found themselves in a shifting landscape. Gunpowder ages changed the nature of war. Long campaigns required logistics more complex than traditional structures could sustain. New technologies demanded flexible training and modernization. The stakes were substantial. A rigid core risked falling behind European armies increasingly adept at firearms. Political entanglements within the palace gave the Janissaries leverage beyond the battlefield. The expansion of urban opportunities tempted soldiers toward trade and civilian life. Human elements of this transformation were intricate Aga commanders, torn between tradition and necessity. Younger Janissaries, more familiar with city life than frontier hardship. Artillery specialists whose technical skills challenged old hierarchies. Reform-minded advisors urging the adoption of new tactics. Yet, innovation struggled against nostalgia. The Janissaries resisted changes that threatened their identity. Their barracks, once symbols of discipline, became hubs of political influence. This was not decline, not yet. It was tension, unresolved and quietly accumulating, like dust on ceremonial armor. The empire still marched, still commanded respect, still held vast territories. But the balance between tradition and progress grew ever more delicate. The sea that tested ambition. While land armies navigated their own transformations, the empire's navy faced challenges on a broader stage. The Mediterranean was no longer a lagoon of Ottoman dominance. Portuguese ships rounded Africa, shifting global trade. Spanish and Venetian fleets adapted rapidly to new maritime technologies. The Indian Ocean, once linked through Mamluk networks, now felt the presence of European powers. The stakes of maritime relevance sharpened. Maintaining control of North African ports required adaptability. Protecting pilgrimage routes demanded reliable logistics. Safeguarding grain shipments became essential for urban stability. Human hands kept these waters navigable, admirals balancing caution with bold maneuvers. Shipwrights experimenting with hybrid designs of sail and oar, navigators learning new currents and wind patterns, dockworkers whose tireless labor sustained the fleet. The innovation during this period lay in strategic endurance. The empire held its own through flexibility alliances and the ability to respond quickly to changing tides. Yet the challenge was clear. The Ottoman navy could no longer rest on earlier triumphs. The world was becoming larger, faster, more interconnected. The empire would need to evolve again, and soon. The mind of the empire. Amid military and administrative shifts, the Ottoman intellectual world experienced its own transformation. Cities like Istanbul, Cairo, Edirne, and Damascus became centers of scholarship, philosophy, jurisprudence, and scientific inquiry. The stakes of intellectual growth were subtle, yet immense. Ideas shaped policy. Philosophy shaped governance. Knowledge shaped the empire's understanding of itself. Scholars across the realm contributed, legal theorists refining the relationship between Sharia and imperial decree. Astronomers charting celestial movements for calendars and navigation. Historians preserving the empire's memory with disciplined objectivity. Poets enriching the cultural identity with verse that captured both devotion and introspection. Innovation in this age took the form of synthesis, absorbing influences from Persian courts, Arab scholarship, Balkan traditions, and Byzantine remnants. The empire became a mosaic of knowledge reflecting the diversity it governed. And yet amid this richness, new uncertainties formed. For as the Ottoman world grew interconnected and refined, it also grew increasingly dependent on stability, a stability that required constant balance between old and new, center and province, military and administration, palace and guild. The stirring beneath the stillness. By the late 16th century, the empire stood at the height of its territorial reach and administrative sophistication. Its cities glowed with prosperity. Its institutions functioned with remarkable efficiency. Its cultural landscape thrived in architecture, poetry, and scholarship. But beneath this stillness, faint tremors began to echo. Demographic shifts straining rural resources, economic fluctuations tied to global silver flows, increased competition from European navies and traders, internal factions negotiating for influence, the Janissary core wrestling with modernization, provincial tensions growing in regions far from the capital. These were not signs of immediate decline, but the early whispers of structural strain. Empires rarely crumble suddenly. They shift, recalibrate, endure, and adapt until one day the weight becomes too great. But that moment was still distant. For now, the Ottoman Empire remained a colossus, glimmering in the light of its golden centuries, walking steadily along a path that would, in time, lead to both triumph and trial. The court that listened to the winds. In the heart of the empire, the palace, once a forge of ambition, became a vessel listening to the changing world outside its gates. The stakes were clear, yet difficult to grasp. The empire was no longer defined by expansion alone, it was defined by the maintenance of what it had already acquired. Territories vast enough to span climates, languages, and traditions required a more intricate rhythm of governance than ever before. Inside the palace, policy debates grew longer. Reports from distant provinces grew more complex. Requests for funds grew heavier, and the gap between expectation and resource widened. Human figures navigated these shifting demands, grand viziers whose authority increasingly resembled that of prime ministers, inner palace advisors interpreting political currents with caution, scribes coordinating an ever-growing flow of correspondence. Princes raised in an environment where politics carried new layers of restraint. The innovation of this era was administrative elasticity, attempts to mold governance to a world undergoing quiet, uneven transformation. But even the most flexible institutions feel strain when forces pull in too many directions at once. The provinces that demanded presence beyond the capital. The provinces, once the empire's greatest strength, became increasingly complex. Demographic changes created pressure on farmland. Long-distance trade altered the economies of port cities. Urban migration transformed the texture of towns and markets. Villages, once stable, now contended with fluctuating prices and shifting expectations. The stakes grew sharper. A late harvest could disrupt regional taxes. Local rivalries could ignite at moments of vulnerability. Distant wars could drain provincial coffers. Rising populations could strain the timar system. Human agents carried the burden, governors balancing imperial directives with local realities, judges resolving disputes that reflected deeper tensions, tax collectors navigating the fine line between duty and provocation, tribal leaders whose cooperation shaped frontier stability. Innovation in the provinces took the form of improvisation. Officials adjusted tax structures, negotiated temporary truces, and created stopgap measures to keep harmony intact. But improvisation, however skillful, could not fully mask the growing complexity of an empire tied into new global economic currents. The silver that tilted the scales. The world economy shifted during this era, quietly, inexorably. Massive silver inflows from the Americas flooded global markets through European intermediaries. Prices across continents rose, currencies devalued, wages lagged behind inflation. Economic rhythms that had sustained empires for generations began to falter. For the Ottomans, the stakes were profound. The timar system struggled as fixed revenues lost purchasing power. Soldiers demanded higher pay to match rising costs. Artisans saw their livelihoods squeeze under fluctuating prices. Provincial markets grew vulnerable to sudden swings. Human reactions shaped the response, treasury officials attempting to stabilize coinage, guildmasters negotiating fair wages amid volatile markets, scholars debating the ethics of price control, merchants adapting trade routes to new realities. The innovation of this era was a series of financial reforms, mint adjustments, tax revisions, and market regulations. But these efforts could only soften, not reverse, the global tide. For the first time, the empire confronted a challenge not born from its own borders, but from the far side of the world. The rebellions that echoed in the countryside. As economic pressures mounted, rural unrest began to surface. Across Anatolia and parts of the Balkans, bands of discontented individuals, former soldiers, displaced villagers, and opportunistic leaders formed insurgent groups known collectively as Salali rebels. The stakes of their uprisings were severe: trade routes disrupted, harvests endangered, local officials targeted, entire regions destabilized. Human stories defined this unrest: peasants burdened by rising costs and uncertain dues, former sipahis unable to maintain their obligations under inflated prices, local leaders using rebellion as pressure against imperial neglect, provincial commanders struggling to restore order without alienating the population. Innovation came not from military suppression alone, but from reconciliation policies, resettlement efforts, and targeted negotiations that sought to heal regions exhausted by chaos. The empire quelled these uprisings, but the memory of unrest lingered like a bruise beneath the skin. It was a reminder that internal balance required more than military force. It required trust. The Janissaries at the threshold of influence. Within the cities, the Janissaries, once the empire's most disciplined soldiers, entered a new era of prominence. They had been allowed urban privileges. They had taken roles in guilds and marketplaces. Their barracks became social and political centers of influence. The stakes of their rising power were unmistakable. Their salaries strained the treasury. Their political voice grew louder in the palace. Their resistance to reform hardened. Their unity created leverage few dared challenge. Human motivations guided this evolution. Older Janissaries bound to tradition and wary of change. Younger recruits inspired by urban life more than battlefield legacy. Aga leaders seeking to maintain authority amid shifting loyalties. Viziers debating whether reform was possible without provoking revolt. The innovation that might have preserved the core, modernization, was the one thing they resisted most fiercely. The empire still relied on their strength, yet felt constrained by their influence. It was a tension that would echo across the next century. The shifts in a world beyond the empire's borders. Meanwhile, Europe transformed. States that once fractured under feudal conflicts began to centralize their monarchies. Technological advances accelerated. Scientific inquiry challenged old paradigms. New colonial networks drew wealth toward Atlantic powers. The stakes for the Ottomans grew sharper with each decade. Rivals adopted new firearms and tactics. Navies expanded beyond traditional Mediterranean limitations. Diplomatic alliances shifted rapidly. The map of influence in Europe changed shape. Ottoman diplomats worked tirelessly managing relations with Vienna, negotiating with Venice, communicating with France, observing the changing balance of power. The innovation in this period was diplomatic adaptation. The empire forged treaties, traded privileges, and sometimes cooperated with former enemies to maintain equilibrium. But the world was no longer the same world the Ottomans had dominated under Suleiman. It grew faster, it grew sharper, it grew more unpredictable, and the empire, though still vast and capable, felt the first steady pull of a gravity that would shape its future. The empire that held its breath. By the late 17th century, the Ottoman Empire remained formidable, influential, and deeply rooted. Its institutions still carried authority. Its armies still commanded respect. Its cities still thrived. Its culture continued to evolve with elegance and strength. But beneath these visible achievements lay a quiet truth. The empire was no longer rising, it was balancing new global economies against old structures, balancing military tradition against technological change, balancing provincial needs against palace politics, balancing diversity against unity, balancing the weight of its own vastness. This was not decline, not yet. It was the beginning of an era defined by resilience and tension adaptation, and inertia, innovation, and hesitation. The empire still stood tall, its domes stretching toward the sky. But the ground beneath them had begun gently, imperceptibly, to shift. The palace, searching for its bearings. The palace, once radiating certainty, now found itself navigating a landscape of contradictions. The stakes were no longer about mere expansion or survival. They were about relevance, the ability to interpret a world that had outgrown the assumptions of earlier centuries. Reports flooded the Imperial Council, European armies testing new infantry formations, naval fleets experimenting with advanced sails and artillery, printing presses spreading knowledge faster than scholars could copy it, scientific academies reshaping mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. Inside the palace, advisors debated with unusual urgency: should the empire imitate foreign innovations? Can reforms be implemented without provoking internal resistance? How does a centuries-old institution preserve dignity while adapting to change? Human voices filled the chambers, conservative courtiers urging caution to preserve tradition, ambitious viziers advocating adaptation to secure the empire's future, young scholars fascinated by European treatises, old scribes wary of losing cultural identity. The innovation that emerged was hesitant, yet real. The empire began to study, translate, and observe foreign advancements more systematically. But observation was not yet transformation, and transformation would prove far more difficult. The provinces pressing against the center. Outside Istanbul, the provinces strained under rising expectations. New economic patterns reshaped regional life. Port cities like Izmir and Aleppo surged with global trade. Inland towns faced declining revenues. Desert routes lost meaning as maritime power shifted westward. Powerful local families gathered influence sometimes beyond imperial control. The stakes of provincial management grew sharper. Tax collection required negotiation rather than command. Infrastructure repairs demanded local cooperation. Population growth heightened regional tension. Land surveys needed updating to reflect shifting realities. The human agents of the provinces became increasingly significant. Iron local notables who balanced imperial loyalty with regional authority. Merchants enriched by new trade flows and emboldened by prosperity. Guild leaders protecting crafts threatened by imported goods. Judges and scholars maintaining legal consistency across changing landscapes. The innovation was unintended. Provincial influence grew not by rebellion, but by necessity. Local leaders filled gaps left by stretched imperial structures. The empire remained intact but increasingly reliant on cooperation rather than direct control. The Ottoman mind awakening to new thought. Across the empire, scholars confronted a profound question. How does one preserve identity while engaging with a world that refuses to stand still? This intellectual tension gave rise to a period of vibrant, if uneven, renewal. The stakes of this awakening were philosophical rather than territorial. Traditional sciences found themselves tested by new discoveries. Astronomy grappled with telescopic observations. Medicine adapted to foreign techniques. Political theory faced questions about sovereignty and reform. Human contributions shaped the contours of this transformation, translators bringing European treatises into Ottoman Turkish, religious scholars debating the harmony between new sciences and established theology, engineers applying mathematical precision to architecture, artillery, and infrastructure, court intellectuals analyzing the changing balance of power abroad. Innovation appeared in subtle forms, new maps with improved accuracy, reorganized schools that blended classical and contemporary knowledge, updated artillery designs informed by foreign manuals, early discussions about institutional reform. Yet, even as ideas blossomed, resistance persisted. Change threatened hierarchies, knowledge threatened tradition. The empire moved forward but cautiously, step by step. The barracks, resisting the future. At the heart of the empire's military challenges lay the Janissary Corps, whose identity had drifted far from the disciplined soldiers of earlier centuries. The stakes were existential. Reform risked rebellion, stagnation risked defeat, moderation pleased no one, and delay invited vulnerability. Human motivations complicated the landscape. Janissary leaders, protective of privileges developed over generations. Urban Janissaries more invested in trade, coffee houses and guilds than in battlefield readiness. State reformers urging modernization at any cost. Provincial soldiers frustrated by unequal pay and inconsistent discipline. The innovation required a modern standing army stood in direct conflict with vested interests. Attempts at reform unfolded unevenly. New drill manuals introduced but sparsely adopted. Imported firearms studied but resisted. European advisors consulted but distrusted. Experimental corps created but undermined. The Janissaries remained a symbol of the empire's past greatness and a barrier to its future. The diplomats who walked the narrow path. While internal debates raged, diplomacy became one of the empire's most essential tools. European states, once fragmented, now consolidated power. Austria strengthened its military administration. Russia expanded southward with relentless intent. Britain and France projected influence through maritime dominance. The stakes for the Ottomans intensified. Defensive alliances became essential. Border negotiations grew more complex. Misunderstandings risked sudden wars. Treaties carried consequences that rippled across continents. Human diplomacy wove fragile threads of stability. Ambassadors observing foreign courts with keen eyes. Envoys negotiating concessions without compromising sovereignty. interpreters bridging cultural and linguistic divides, strategists analyzing shifting alliances. The innovation was the creation of a more formal diplomatic corps, a recognition that survival required not only armies, but understanding. For the first time, Ottoman diplomats lived abroad for extended periods, internalizing the rhythms of Europe, bringing home knowledge that would shape future reforms. The cities illuminated by new luxuries. Despite political and military pressures, Ottoman cities thrived in cultural vibrancy. Istanbul's markets glowed with imported cloth spices, glass and goods from every corner of the Mediterranean. Cafes buzzed with conversation, poetry, debates, and rumor. Print culture, still tightly controlled, quietly crept forward under foreign influence. The stakes of this cultural expansion lay in identity. Prosperity brought comfort. Comfort brought change. Change brought new behaviors. And new behaviors sparked new expectations. Human scenes colored the era. Poets blending classical forms with contemporary themes. Musicians developing styles that merged Anatolian, Balkan, and Middle Eastern influences. Calligraphers refining scripts that balanced elegance with clarity. Merchants connecting the empire to global luxury networks. Innovation emerged through cultural exchange rather than political decree. The empire absorbed influences from Europe, Persia, and North Africa, not as imitation, but as adaptation. Yet behind these vibrant cities, a deeper truth shimmered. The empire was entering a twilight not defined by darkness, but by the long shadows cast by the brilliance of its earlier centuries. The balance that grew harder to hold. By the end of the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire remained vast and culturally rich. Its cities bustled, its provinces produced, its military still commanded respect in many theaters, its diplomacy kept powerful enemies at bay, but the balance had grown delicate. Too many institutions pulling in too many directions. Too many reforms resisted at decisive moments. Too many global shifts reshaping the world beyond its borders. This was not collapse. This was not decline in the dramatic sense. This was the slow tightening of circumstances, an empire maintaining dignity, identity, and cohesion while the world around it accelerated toward new frontiers. The lanterns of the Ottoman world still glowed, but the light they cast revealed a path increasingly narrow, where each decision carried consequences that echoed far beyond the palace walls. The empire walked forward, steady, cautious, dignified, into an era where twilight stretched long over continents and centuries. The throne that felt the weight of centuries. By the early 19th century, the Sultan's role had changed beyond the imagination of his ancestors. He was no longer simply commander, judge, and guardian. He had become the axis of a world struggling to reconcile memory with necessity. The stakes were immense. Failure to modernize could mean disintegration. Modernizing too quickly could trigger internal revolt. Balancing reform and tradition required precision, bordering on impossibility. Human forces in the palace reflected this tension, reformist advisors urging swift adoption of European techniques, traditionalists warning that foreign influence endangered identity, younger officials curious about new sciences and administration, older bureaucrats guardians of centuries-old customs. The innovation of this era took the form of introspection, a realization that survival required reimagining not only institutions but the very purpose of imperial authority. No single figure embodied this awakening more profoundly than the Sultan who attempted to reshape the foundations of power itself. The Sultan who reshaped the empire in fire. When Mahmud II ascended the throne, he inherited an empire straining under the contradictions of the age. Provincial leaders commanded armies. Janissaries resisted reform. European technologies advanced faster than Ottoman institutions could adapt. Diplomacy grew more complex with each shifting alliance. The stakes of Mahmud's reign were stark. The empire could modernize or fracture. The military could reform or collapse. The center could reassert authority or yield to centrifugal forces. Mahmud chose transformation even if it came at great cost. His most consequential act erupted like lightning, the destruction of the Janissary Corps during the auspicious incident of 1826. Human courage and terror filled that moment. Modern troops trained in new drills enforcing the Sultan's decree. Janissary rebels lighting fires in the streets of Istanbul. Civilians watching centuries of history collapse in hours. Reformists realizing that change once unleashed could not be contained. Innovation followed the shock. A modern army formed along European lines. New ministries organized state functions with greater clarity. Uniforms replaced traditional garb. Postal systems, schools and factories emerged across provinces. Mahmud's reforms did not create instant stability, but they redirected the empire toward a modern path it had long hesitated to enter. Still, modernization came at a price. Breakdown of old loyalties, resistance from conservative factions, and increasing involvement of European powers in Ottoman affairs. The empire moved forward, but every step left an echo. The provinces redrawn by new realities. As central reforms accelerated, the provinces experienced upheavals of their own. The stakes of provincial governance grew unpredictable. Nationalist movements emerged across the Balkans. Tribal confederations in Arabia asserted autonomy. Regional wars reshaped loyalties. Population shifts altered economic foundations. Human experiences varied widely. Greeks, inspired by European intellectual currents, sought independence. Serbs, balancing negotiation and rebellion, carved out local authority. Egyptians under Muhammad Ali built their own military and administrative frameworks. Arabs, divided among tribes and coastal cities, reacted differently to reforms. Armenians and Bulgarians navigating social mobility and rising national identity. The innovation in the provinces was unintended. As reforms spread, so did aspirations for self-rule. The empire confronted a challenge no conquest or legal code had prepared it for: the rise of national consciousness, a force as potent as armies and as persistent as faith. The diplomacy of a tightening circle. European powers, sensing opportunity, approached the empire with offers of alliance, assistance, and influence. The stakes of diplomacy rose dramatically. Russia sought access to the Black Sea and protection rights over Orthodox subjects. Britain aimed to secure routes to India. France advanced claims of protecting Catholic communities. Austria maneuvered to maintain influence in the Balkans. Ottoman diplomats walked a narrow path, offering trade privileges to secure alliances, negotiating territorial disputes with caution, balancing one power against another, attempting to preserve sovereignty amid encroaching pressures. Human negotiators became essential ambassadors, reporting European moods and intentions. Legal scholars drafting agreements compatible with both tradition and modern requirements. Strategists anticipating long-term consequences of each treaty. Innovation took the form of realpolitik. The empire learned to use diplomacy not merely as communication, but as a survival mechanism. Yet each treaty, each alliance tied the empire more tightly into the political ambitions of Europe. The Tanzimat, a new vision for a fragile world. In the mid-19th century, the empire embraced one of the most ambitious reform programs in its history, the Tanzimat. Its stakes were unprecedented: equal legal status for all subjects, modernized tax systems, updated military recruitment, new educational institutions, reorganized provincial administration, improved infrastructure linking cities and ports. Human ideals propelled these reforms. Statesmen like Mustafa Reshid Pasha, Ali Pasha, and Fuat Pasha, bureaucrats determined to stabilize the empire, scholars envisioning a modern cohesive society, merchants and intellectuals supporting reforms to align with global trade. Innovation flourished, newspapers circulated new ideas, modern schools taught sciences alongside classical subjects, telegraph lines shortened distances between provinces, railways linked cities previously separated by days of travel. The Tanzimat unlocked new possibilities and new anxieties. For traditional elites, reforms seemed like an erosion of identity. For rising national groups, reforms ignited aspirations for full sovereignty. For European powers, reforms provided justification for further intervention. The empire walked a tightrope between renewal and fragmentation. The empire, contemplating its own image. As the century advanced, a new question surfaced. What does it mean to be an empire in the age of nations? This question shaped the consciousness of the late Ottoman elite. Was the empire a family of peoples held together by loyalty? Was it a multi-ethnic legal entity defined by shared rights? Was it a Muslim dynasty seeking new footing in a secularizing world? Was it a state among states equals sovereign and modern? Human anxieties colored these debates, reformists hoping modernization could preserve unity, traditionalists fearing loss of cultural and religious identity, minority communities balancing loyalty with national awakening, soldiers and administrators navigating the gulf between old routines and new requirements. Innovation surfaced in new institutions, academies teaching political science, councils crafting constitutional frameworks, journals debating identity and representation, committees proposing modern civic structures. But even as ideas multiplied, the empire felt the ground shifting beneath it, not from a single crisis, but from an accumulation of pressures that no state, however resilient, could ignore. The storm before the transformation. By the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire remained alive, not in decline's caricatured collapse, but in a state of profound transition. Its cities sparkled with life. Its intellectuals debated the future with fervor. Its diplomats maneuvered with skill. Its people carried memories of centuries of shared history. Yet challenges gathered like distant thunder wars in the Balkans tested the empire's strength. Economic pressures deepened with global markets. Nationalist aspirations grew louder. Internal reforms struggled against time. European empires encircled the region with increasing confidence. This was not the fall, not yet. The empire still breathed, adapted, negotiated, and endured, but the modern storm approached, bringing change that would reshape continents and transform the Ottoman world into something new, unexpected, and irrevocably different. The twilight lengthened not as darkness, but as a moment suspended before dawn breaks into an entirely new era. The Sultan who dreamed of constitutional order. When Abdulhamid II ascended the throne, the empire faced storms on all fronts. The Balkan uprisings, provincial tensions, foreign interventions, and economic pressures formed a labyrinth that no ruler could navigate without caution. The stakes of his reign were immense. A constitution promised new unity. A parliament sought shared governance. Political factions vied for influence. European powers hovered over every decision. Human forces shaped this era with competing visions. Liberal intellectuals advocating constitutional monarchy. Bureaucrats cautious yet hopeful for structured reform. Ulema defending tradition with measured resolve. Military officers aware the empire required modernization. Minority leaders negotiating rights and autonomy. The innovation that emerged was a constitutional experiment flickering, fragile, interrupted, but never forgotten. Yet the empire's challenges required more than constitutional ideals. They required a fundamental restructuring of the state itself. The young officers who carried the future. Out of military academies and intellectual circles rose a new generation. The Young Turks, a movement built from frustration, ambition, and a belief that the empire could still be saved through decisive reform. Their stakes were urgent: revive the constitution, limit autocratic power, unify the empire around civic identity, modernize institutions in the face of global competition. Human ambitions colored their ascent: medical students reading political philosophy in secret, junior officers witnessing failures on battlefield frontiers, journalists printing ideas smuggled across borders, diplomats aware of international perceptions. The innovation they sought was structural transformation, a shift from dynastic absolutism toward constitutionalism and centralized administration. When they achieved their revolution in 1908, Parliament reopened, newspapers flourished with competing ideas, and the empire briefly tasted political pluralism. But the world had grown too turbulent for idealism alone. The provinces breaking into new identities. Across the Balkans and beyond, nationalist movements pressed harder than ever. The stakes for the empire became brutally clear. Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria asserted independent political identities. Bosnia and Herzegovina fell under Austro-Hungarian administration. Crete shifted beyond Ottoman influence. Albania struggled between autonomy and loyalty. Human stories shaped this, unraveling villages caught between imperial armies and nationalist militias. Merchants redefining loyalties through economic opportunity. Clergy guiding communities toward separate futures. Local leaders balancing tradition and aspiration. The innovation of nationalism could not be reversed. It was a new political force, not a passing movement. the empire responded with reform diplomacy and military action. But demographic, cultural, and ideological tides had turned irreversibly. The army remade in urgency. As borders shifted and wars erupted, the Ottoman military underwent the most intense modernization efforts in its history. The stakes were existential: adopt new formations, study German and French military doctrine, reorganize logistics and supplies, strengthen the officer corps, rebuild morale shattered by loss. Human willpower carried this transformation. Enver Pasha inspired yet controversial, pressing radical reforms. Veteran generals balancing experience with new methods, engineers constructing railways vital for military movement, young cadets learning mathematics, physics, and tactics in modern academies. The innovation was immense, but time was short. The empire was racing toward a global conflict for which no state was fully prepared. The World War that tested every foundation. When the First World War erupted, the Ottoman Empire faced a decision with consequences beyond imagination. The stakes were absolute: join the Central Powers and gamble on victory, join the Allies and risk historical rivalries, remain neutral and hope to avoid the encroaching storm. The empire chose alliance with Germany, a decision shaped by geopolitics necessity and the belief that survival required boldness. Human endurance defined the war years: soldiers fighting across deserts, mountains, and icy fronts, civilians enduring shortages and uncertainty, nurses and physicians battling disease and injury, commanders navigating impossible circumstances. Battles across Gallipoli, the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, Arabia, and Palestine marked some of the most challenging campaigns in Ottoman history. Innovation occurred in desperation: new fortifications along coasts, railway networks supporting critical supply lines, coordination with German officers and strategists. But the pressures of World War were overwhelming. The empire fought with dignity and resilience, yet the geopolitical storm sweeping across continents was one no pre-industrial state could withstand unscathed. The empire becoming a nation. When the war ended, the Ottoman world faced its greatest test: defeat, occupation, and the disintegration of the imperial system. The stakes of this moment were unparalleled. Sovereignty itself hung in the balance. Foreign armies entered Istanbul and coastal Anatolia. Treaties threatened to carve the heartland into fragments. Yet from this devastation emerged a new force, a movement rooted not in dynasty, but in collective resolve: the Turkish national movement, led by figures determined to preserve sovereignty through political and military reorganization. Human determination shaped this rebirth: commanders choosing resistance over surrender, villagers and townspeople supporting local militias, teachers and officials forming assemblies in Anatolia, writers and poets forging new narratives of unity. Innovation became existential: a new parliament convened in Ankara. National armies replaced imperial legions. Diplomacy secured recognition of borders. Reforms laid the groundwork for a modern republic. What emerged from this crucible was not the continuation of empire, but the transformation of a people, a new state, rising from the legacy of a centuries-old civilization, the legacy that outlived the empire. When the Ottoman Empire formally ended in 1922 with the abolition of the Sultanate, its fall was not a collapse into oblivion, but a transition into another form of political life. The stakes of its legacy reverberate. Even now its cities remain cultural crossroads of continents. Its legal structures shaped modern constitutions. Its architecture defines skylines from Sarajevo to Istanbul to Cairo. Its administration influenced systems across the Middle East and Balkans. Its multilingual, multi-ethnic world remains a reference for coexistence. Its memory lives in music, art, food, literature, and identity. Human endurance carried its essence forward: families that lived under its rule for generations, communities shaped by its diversity, states built along the contours of its former provinces, scholars who preserve its history, artists who reinterpret its culture. Innovation continues. The Ottoman past is not static. It is studied, reimagined, debated, and woven into modern narratives. The empire has ended, but its influence endures like the echo of a long, resonant note, the dawn after the long night. And so our journey ends, not with the fall of an empire, but with the rise of a new era shaped by its memory. The Ottomans ruled for 6 centuries, through triumph and tragedy, through splendor and strain, through continuity and change. Their story is not a straight line, but a river, widening, narrowing, bending, shaped by mountains, plains, and storms, yet always moving toward the vastness ahead. And as the final chapter closes, the empire does not vanish into darkness. It settles into history, leaving behind a horizon illuminated by architecture, law, poetry, faith, diplomacy, diversity, and the enduring complexity of human endeavor. A twilight that lasted centuries finally gives way to a new morning. And in that morning lives the legacy of everything the Ottoman world once was and everything it continues to inspire, 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 continues to inspire.